Good evening, everyone. My name is Marie Fusaro. I am a long-term Bolton resident and a fairly new member of the Bolton Human Services and Safety Committee. It's my pleasure to introduce this evening's presenter, Elizabeth Beliveau. Elizabeth is a licensed independent clinical social worker, a graduate of the College of the Holy Cross, and Boston College School of Social Work. She is an experienced professional who has been intensively trained in a number of treatment modalities. Excuse me. In addition to providing direct care services, she provides consultation and clinical supervision to practitioners and advises various organizations on program and service development. She is a faculty member at Bay Path University Graduate School of Mental Health Counseling and Mount Wachusett Community College. In addition, she serves as a board member of the National Association of Social Workers and the Rise Above Foundation. In 2014, Elizabeth founded Enlightened Interventions, based in Worcester, Massachusetts. This full-scale wellness center offers comprehensive services focused on promoting wellness and change from a holistic treatment perspective. Elizabeth has presented on this timely issue of bullying a number of times, and we're very pleased to have her with us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me here today. Before we get going, one of the things I always like to talk about is when we're talking about bullying from a psychoeducational standpoint, which is what I'm here doing tonight. It's important to remember that any advice or feedback that you would receive here today doesn't take the place of information that you would get from a licensed professional who is familiar with yourself, your child, your family, or your situation. So the first thing that I always like to remind people is if there is bullying or things going on in your life that are making you feel unsafe or making you unable to live your best life, the first and best resource to seek out is that there's plenty of wonderful professionals in your area who have the experience and the skills to help you through that, and I encourage you to reach out there. And if you don't have the resources about who to reach out to, reaching out to your local Human Services and Safety Committee here in the town of Bolton. So tonight we're going to talk about bullying and how bullying affects our lives, what we can do about bullying, and a little bit of understanding about bullying. So the first thing I'm going to ask is those of you in the audience, raise your hand if somehow, in some way, you or someone you love has been affected by bullying throughout the years. Absolutely. So what you will notice if you are here tonight with us is that 100% of the people in our audience have been affected by bullying. Bullying is pervasive. It's been a buzzed about topic without a lot of really good plans about how we address bullying. So the first thing I think it's really important to talk about is that bullying is not something that is specific to children. I think typically when we think about bullying, we think about bullying in the aspect of school-based bullying or childhood bullying. And of course, this is the type of bullying that gets publicized by the media very often. Can anyone out here think about a highly publicized bullying case that's been in the media recently? Go ahead.
There was a case, I think it was in the Worcester area a while back, where a girl committed suicide after being bullied.
Yes, and actually there was a very famous case out in Western Mass area, the case of Phoebe Price, who was a really famous case, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago at this time. She was an international student, very heavily bullied, specifically during the emergence of social media among kids this age, and she did end up taking her own life. I think one of the reasons we see a lot of talk around bullying with especially teenagers and children is because of this piece about the vulnerability that comes with being a child or an adolescent, and because of that, the high risks we often see around kids who are being bullied. These include things like they have school refusal, they have suicide attempts, they have significant depression and anxiety when they're going through bullying, and because of that, we talk a lot about that. What we don't talk about is that little bullies grow up to be big bullies, right? And that bullying is unfortunately a pattern that travels with us throughout our life. If you don't believe me, I'm going to tell you about a really, really great case study around bullying that actually took place in an assisted living community in Florida. What they found in this assisted living community is that there was significant bullying going on amongst the residents there. And that because of that, the residents who were being bullied or picked on were experiencing many of the same symptoms that the National Institute for Health has found that children or adolescents who are bullied experience. So we're looking at two opposite ends, right, of the life development spectrum with this similar experience of bullying, which I think speaks to just how powerful bullying can be. But when we think about bullying, go ahead, do you have a question?
I was just going to mention that in town, we actually had to have the police chief come and talk to the folks at the manor and talk to them about how things were being interpreted, talk about all of this.
Absolutely.
And it was actually very serious, but I gather it's very common.
Absolutely. We also see significant, that's a great example, significant bullying happening in workplaces. What's really interesting is if you look at the research behind bullying, what we have found is that bullying in workplaces is not dependent on either the stress level of the place of work or the primary gender of the people practicing or working within the environment. So that we were seeing bullying culture in mills and in kind of mill occupations, all the way through medical offices, the biotech industry, school systems and teachers even, that it's really just pervasive in all working cultures. And what we found is, okay, so if it's not related to occupation, it's not related to region, it's not related to gender, what are we finding here? And again, it's around the community response and the level of acceptance around a toxic bullying culture that allows pervasive bullying to continue. So what actually is bullying? Might be one of the things that you think about. So many of you out there might be thinking, oh, in my day, we didn't complain about this kind of stuff, kids just dealt with it. And that may be true, which is why I think it's important to really differentiate between what teasing, mean moments, and bullying. So, people out here, raise your hand if you've ever had something come out of your mouth that maybe wasn't the nicest thing about somebody in your life. Absolutely, right? So, we all have mean moments in our life. That's a normal part of human nature. We all have times where we snap a little bit, or we just don't say the kindest thing. Maybe it comes from a place of anger, or frustration, or jealousy, or the full spectrum of other emotions that we experience on a regular basis. And the typical response when you've hurt somebody is you have that ability to then empathize with that person's feelings, address that hurt and that harm you've done with them, make amends, and move on. That is the mean moment experience for people. This is the normative mean moment experience for people. However, what ends up happening in bullying culture is that we don't have people who are able to do that empathy piece. And outside of that, a mean moment is a singular, or at most actually it's defined as 3 times event, versus bullying is defined as relentless, pervasive patterns of behavior. I'll give you a great case study. I do a lot of work with public school systems, and I was called in to do some work between a group of 8th grade girls who, when you think of bullying, you think of 8th grade girls a lot of the time, to really talk about what was going on in their group of friends. And it was a really interesting group in that they really had teasing, mean moments, and bullying all going on amongst different members of this group at different times. So the first kid and I come in and we start to talk. We talk about what's going on. And she talks about this other member of the group. We'll call her Annie. The kid says to me, well, Annie always gets everything she wants. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? She said, well, her boyfriend is the cutest boy in the class. And she said, when Annie gets to be the captain of the soccer team, I really wanted to be the captain. Annie got to be the captain. She always gets everything she wants. Everyone always thinks she's so perfect. right? So immediately I'm picking up on some frustration. So one of the things I said to her, she said, so the other day, Annie had her shirt on inside out at school, and I laughed at her, and I pointed it out to her. And she said she got really embarrassed. And I said, wow. I said, how did you feel when you do that? Well, when I did that, I started to feel bad. I was teasing her, and it wasn't okay. It was a singular event moment when I processed it with this child. Clearly, when we hear that case study, coming from a place of jealousy, and she was able to kind of learn and move on. The other really important thing to remember is this child was able to empathize with the origin of her frustration with Annie, right? She was able to identify her jealousy and process through that and understand and care about Annie to a point where she didn't want to hurt her feelings anymore. Moved on to the next child in the group. This child, again, talked about my friend Annie. And again, talked about a lot of jealous themes that were going on there. And she talked about how she got a lot of delight of sticking her foot out when Annie walked up last year to get an award at the assembly night. And she talked in delight about telling everybody when Annie had called her about breaking up with a boyfriend and was crying and sad. She talked about enjoying sharing the social media messages, their private messages they sent to each other, and screenshotting them and posting them on Facebook. And she had a very little connection and understanding around the impact that this had had on this friend and this friend circle. So I would ask the people in this room, what do you guys think? Are we dealing more with bullying or teasing or mean moments there? Bullying, absolutely. The key indicator besides the pervasiveness was the lack of understanding that went along with the child I was talking to and her actions towards the person in this friend circle. When we're thinking about bullying, the children or adults who are typically taking part in the bullying have this way of almost disassociating themselves from the object of their ire or their anger, and they stop being able to empathize with that person. This is a constant that you'll see in the counseling profession when we are working with people with patterns of bullying. They truthfully stop seeing people as people. And they are so enveloped by their own feelings of anger or rage or jealousy or frustration that it becomes easy to stop seeing somebody as a valued person and as the object of how they are going to get these feelings out. The old idea that hurt people hurt is absolutely true when it comes to bullying. What we have found when we've studied bullies, little bullies all the way through big bullies, is that typically these are people that have high levels of insecurity, that have high levels of depression and anxiety, both in their families and outside of them, their families. How they have significant levels of inferiority. We see a high level of learning disorders among kids who are doing bullying. These are not kids who are feeling highly, or adults who are feeling highly successful in their everyday environments. What's really interesting, and we'll talk more about this as we go on, but for successful bullying intervention programs, typically what we're looking at is as much treatment towards the bullies around their own sense of self as treatment around stopping the act of bullying. So does anybody have any questions? Go ahead.
When we did a bunch of domestic violence forums,
Yep.
it was said over and over again that the children in the family were learning from the father.
Yep.
Or the mother, whoever was the most aggressive in the confrontation. And so it was described as, a full life experience.
Absolutely. Cycles of violence, so I want to be really clear, bullying is a form of violence. I think that a lot of times we forget that piece, that this is a form of covert violence. It's a form of abuse towards people, and it has dire consequences. Just like children who grow up in violent homes are affected by it, little bullies a lot of times have learned the behavior from big bullies. And we see this all the time in treatment. So it's really important to also think about your own parenting and the kids in your life and what they're watching when you, do they have an older sibling who's engaging in bullying behavior? Are they around when somebody's talking about, our highly charged online culture and, the Facebook mob or mentality of somebody on a town page? What are they hearing, and more importantly, what's your reaction to these things? Are they around and hearing that this is a way that you gain power, or this is something that's funny, or this is something that's serving a purpose? If so, little ears are taking that information in as a way to earn power, to be powerful, or to be important. Bullying is a learned behavior, so you're absolutely right with that. Great. Any other questions before we move on? Yeah, go ahead.
What's the line between sexual harassment and bullying?
So that's a really good question. So when you look at the definition of sexual harassment, it can be anything from unwanted touching to unwanted comments. The same thing goes for bullying. What is also really important to remember about bullying is many times, it's difficult to charge somebody in a court of law around bullying. However, many, many times people who engaged in bullying end up inadvertently breaking the law. And I'll give you an example. I won't name the town that this happened in, but I worked on a case a few years ago where it was a group of children, and a girl and a boy had been at a party and they had engaged in some sexual activity together. Well, unbeknownst to the girl, the boy's friends had videotaped this and used this cell phone video to really pick on and torture this girl and destroy her reputation and bully her pretty significantly. So this escalated and pretty significantly, and the girl ended up having some really severe consequences to her own mental health and well-being around it. So one of the things that ended up happening when this all it escalated all the way to the legal level is that it's illegal to distribute a video of a child under the age, a child under the age of 18 engaged in a sexual act. So in fact, the original boy who had disseminated this video was actually charged with distribution of pornography. So that's pretty significant when you think about it. And this happens a lot. When there's physical bullying involved, you can be charged with assault and battery or other crimes around putting your hands on someone. There's just a lot of ways that, although bullying isn't necessarily on our books in Massachusetts law, a lot of the ways that we do bully is actually breaking the law. So that's a great question. Other questions before we move on? So we've talked a lot about kids. Let's talk about some of what adult bullying looks like. What we found is that a lot of times bullying ends up being very gendered. And that although we're seeing more and more traditional male bullying cross those lines into covert bullying, what we find is that females typically engage in this covert bullying. This is bullying behavior that is very under the radar. It's sarcasm and snide comments and sharing videos or text messages or Facebook messages with each other. It's the relentless, cruel comments that are just this line of passive that it's almost difficult to be able to address it head on. Versus traditionally, male gendered bullying has been very overt. It's typically been physical. It's typically shorter in duration, as you probably can tell, mirroring that typical idea of gendered violence with men and women. What we are finding is that much more bullying is crossing into this idea of covert bullying. My belief around this is very much due to the social media era. Social media has allowed us a platform to engage in pretty significant bullying on children all the way through older adults. So let's talk about some of the ways that happens. So when we think about your traditional bullying experience for a child. On Facebook, it might be someone publishing a private text message and a picture, or it could be somebody writing a mean post about you. And those are, I think, are the things that we think of as not okay. But let's think about our own behavior, even as adults, in terms of what kind of bullying that looks like. So I'll give you another example. I recently consulted on a case in the Worcester area where a small business owner had a legal dispute with somebody she was doing business with. And that person took it upon themselves to then go onto the town page and write a lot of really cruel lies about this person's business, right? So when you look at something like that, obviously this has dire effects on this person's business. In this case, the woman ran a daycare and childcare center. She can't go on there and defend herself, of course, because she needs to be professional and not identify this family. And she can't talk about the truth behind the matter. So I'll ask you guys, what do you think happened to this woman's business because somebody posted this on this page? People pulled their kids out of her childcare center. And not just that, what was really important is the mental health effects of being worried about what am I going to sign on to Facebook and see people saying about myself, my family, and my business. Those of you out here know how important your business or your livelihood is to you. The threat of losing that is an example of financial bullying, which is really, really significant for people. Go ahead.
I just watched a little documentary on Hernandez.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize, but it came out that, he was upbeat and thinking he'd get his first conviction overturned, and then he committed suicide, they said. And it came out that he was gay, and it was revealed on a talk radio show and talked about raunchy, and a newspaper reporter, they speculated that someone on the police with police connections released it, and they were trying to, his lawyers think he might have committed suicide because that was revealed and then discussed in public, and it is, that is truly a horrible form of bullying.
Absolutely, that's such a great example. And I think what you're talking about here is also that adults are not immune to the significant consequences of bullying. That, as well as the case I just gave you about the woman's livelihood, are examples about what sometimes what I like to call keyboard warriors can do in a bullying era. And so let's look at that from a much lesser perspective. Think about, we live in a very politically charged community right now and time. So thinking about, the person who puts a pretty strong political stance up, right? And all of a sudden there's 100 people attacking them on this post, right? This is an example of that keyboard warrior bullying mob mentality effect, right? People can sit there and they have that disassociation, that anonymity of being behind a keyboard. But what it feels like to be insulted as that person and be attacked for their belief system, there's a real life person on the other end of that. And a social media era has allowed us to, I think, to forget that a lot. And I think especially as we come 2 weeks away as of tonight from election season, we're seeing this a lot from people. What do you guys think? Do you guys think the social media era has really amped up the bullying?
I think too, even before Facebook and everything, when my kids were in school, I remember emailing one of their teachers, and then I reread the email after I wrote it, and I thought, wow, I wonder if that could come across harsh. So I sent her another email saying, I'm sorry if I came across harsh. And she said, oh, thank you for responding, because yes, I read it completely different than what you intended. And so I find sometimes, I just type things in, and you don't think about the person reading it isn't getting your facial expression, the tone of your voice, the ha-ha,
That's
it's
right.
They read it how and they perceive it maybe differently than you have meant it.
So one of the greatest examples that I give around that, I call it the I thought you said example. So I want you to imagine that you send a text message or an email to somebody you work with or in your family, and you start it with, I thought you said, fill in the blank. You went to the grocery store, you were working late tonight. Think about that statement. You could be saying, oh, I thought you said you were gonna work late tonight. Or, I thought you said you picked up the fish for dinner. There's so many different ways that can be interpreted, which changes the response, right? So when you're thinking about something like that, there's no way to tell. And how many examples do we have behind a keyboard or a cell phone that can be misread by people, right? And I think we see this a lot in covert bullying behavior.
You know, may I say something about
Yeah.
the whole thing about the kind of the disconnection, like you're behind a keyboard, you're behind a screen. Even just, you know, various work sites, people want to get into like a round table discussion. That's really dicey.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, you know, people take things wrong.
Absolutely. It's really interesting too. You know, gone are the days of that real nitty-gritty discussion piece that we could have within consultations, both in the occupational and the classroom settings, because people cross those lines so easily, you know. We even see it very much in the difference between, you know, we live in an era where there's many online classes now. So, you know, different from that traditional classroom experience, where you have a professor or somebody, a lecturer, standing in front of you versus behind a computer screen. It's interesting. One of the research areas I've always looked at is, you know, the difference in those professor reviews from behind a computer screen or in person. What we have found just in, you know, the universities that I work at is that in-person experience creates that human bond where the feedback tends to be much more, not always even positive, but constructively critical versus attacking where you've lacked that human bond. So just something, again, to think about. Questions so far? Great. So what can we do about this? Might be some of the things that you're thinking about. So the first thing that we can do is for you parents out there who have children at home is 3 really important steps. Don't model bullying, shut down bullying behavior, and what I think is probably the most important one, if you have children who engage in teasing, mean moments, or bullying, let them feel those consequences. One of the things that, think about how people learn, especially how children learn. If we have children who are engaging in bullying or teasing or mean moment experiences as children, which, let's be honest, most kids at least put a foot into the water and experiment with that. We have to fight that effect to swoop in and say that not my kid. My kid didn't do that, or my kid didn't mean that. You can't punish my kid, right? We need to let systems send the message really clearly to kids that this isn't okay, and we need to model that. One of the best bullying interventions I ever saw was with a group of parents. We were involved in a pretty significant bullying incident at a suburban high school in central Massachusetts. And I was just awestruck by the difference in responses from parents. You know, from everything, oh, my kid wouldn't do that, to the, oh, it's just one time, or, oh, you know, this is just what kids do. And the kids had some pretty significant consequences in the school among losing privilege to go to a homecoming dance. And there was this one couple that came in, the parents, and looked right at their kid, and they said, I hope the kid that you picked on has fun at that dance. You'll be home doing chores for every single weekend after that, because this isn't how we act in this family. And we don't see enough of that, right? The message that kid got is, this is not the value system I was raised with. And believe it or not, those core beliefs in kids are strong. Every time a kid sees you undermine accountability for them, the message you are sending to them is, this isn't something I think is important. This isn't something I value. So it's really important that when our kids do that, we hold fast, we hold them accountable, and we support the systems that keep them accountable. Second, yeah, go ahead.
So I don't know like what the school district does now or anything, but my daughter, when she was in 4th grade ratted out an 8th grader who was bullying an even younger kid.
Yeah.
And she and the victim had to go to the principal's office and confront these older 8th graders. And when she got off the school bus after school, one of her friends said, "You better hire a bodyguard for your daughter. She just ratted out an 8th grader." And so as a parent too,
Absolutely.
like I always wanted my kids to stick up for people, but you're worried sometimes about their safety and what are the
Absolutely.
consequences of.
So without kind of attacking anybody else's choices, I mean, so that was a pretty inappropriate reaction in that kind of case. Just thinking about power differentials, which we know exist in bullying scenarios, a 4th grader is about 9 years old. It is totally inappropriate to set a 9-year-old up against a 13 or 14-year-old and have that conversation. Developmentally, they're at different stages. Size-wise, they're at different stages. And any time that you're looking to do a process-oriented or learning teachable moment, you know you have to have people that are open to learning and teaching. A 9-year-old that's going to walk in terrified is going to have no teachable moment for themselves. So in that case, that was kind of an ineffectual response. It's also important that we don't just protect victims, but we protect whistleblowers too. There are lots of people, it's a really hard place to be, to stand up and say, hey, something's wrong here, right? There's a reason there's federal whistleblower laws that protect people in business environments. Because retaliation is awful for people. And if we create cultures of tolerating retaliation or setting people up for retaliation, all we're doing is creating a culture where people aren't going to speak up when scary or hard things are happening. That's not what we want to do either.
That perpetuates bullying too.
Very much so.
People get fearful of speaking up,
And
it just keeps the
absolutely.
cycle going.
And that perpetuates powerlessness too. And powerlessness is one of the most painful and long-term effects that come from bullying. That I know something's wrong and I can't do anything about it. That has really long-term consequences, and we don't want any of our kids or adults feeling like that, so absolutely. So we need to really advocate for protections for whistleblowers and for kids that speak up or adults that speak up in the workplace, in the assisted living complex, or in our classroom. So absolutely, it's a great example. Other questions? As parents, we need to model and teach empathy. Empathy, people always say, well, okay, so what's the opposite of bullying? The opposite of bullying is empathy. What we have found is that kind kids, accepting kids, the kind of kids that you want your children to grow up to be and to marry, are kids with high levels of empathy. They're high levels of critical thinking, and they're able to put themselves in other people's shoes. So what's really interesting is developmentally, empathy is developed by age 5. And it's continued to be supported through adolescence and adulthood. That we know that there's some things that get in the way of empathy, such as some mental health struggles and trauma. However, it's really easy to build a culture of empathy in our home, to have conversations about how our actions affect other people. It's the small conversations, like when you see your child drop a piece of paper on the ground and not pick it up. What would happen if everybody did that? Well, we wouldn't have a nice clean park anymore for kids to go play in, right? Or conversations, what would happen if, and teaching kids and having conversations around what would happen if something happened to them. Well, how would you feel if you were excluded from the birthday party? And giving kids positive, appropriate outlets when they feel mad, jealous, or frustrated. Those are 3 normal feelings, a lot of times associated with bullying. It's not realistic to expect our kids to never feel those feelings, but how can we teach kids to cope with those feelings or deal with those feelings in a safe and appropriate way? Example of jealousy, correct? We all feel jealous here and there, right? So how do you teach people to have a conversation about that when you can use jealousy as a motivator? Boy, I'm really jealous of Johnny. He gets an A on every test. I'm going to study really hard like him so I get an A on every test. And facilitating those conversations from people. Teaching people to celebrate their friends' victories for them. You know, when your kid comes home and says, so-and-so got picked as the class president, instead of going to the place, well, why didn't you get that? Is, wow, isn't that so great for so-and-so? How did you celebrate with them? How does it feel to be really happy for your friend? These are really good higher order skills that we want to teach our kids. And believe it or not, this is what develops functional adults, right? This is what teaches people to have functional friendships, long-term relationships, be successful in workplaces. There's lots and lots of benefits outside of just not bullying for kids who learn to do this. And the last thing that we really want to do is intervene in an appropriate way when we know bullying is going on. The worst thing that we can do as adults is stand by, right? When you hear that there's these patterns going on, intervene. Have a hard conversation with kids or adults or at work, or go to people who can intervene. Don't become a part of those kind of toxic cultures that allow for that bullying behavior. And teach and practice tolerance in your own life. So we're about 40 minutes in, so I wanted to kind of open up to some questions or some follow-up or feedback from you guys.
No. No.
No, nothing?
Well, as a mother, but also as a grandmother,
Yes.
I am now seeing through my grandkids
Yep.
those same repetitive kinds of things that
Yep.
come up. And I challenge myself to try to reach out and work. And so that was why I really came, was to hear some suggestions and potential solutions to some of these issues, because the world goes round.
Yeah, I think that's some great feedback. And I also, the biggest thing that I talk about, the best intervention for bullying, if you want to raise kids that don't bully, is don't wait until they're bullying. Raise the kind of kids that you want to grow up into the kind of adults that you want to be friends with, right? The old saying of, you know, raise a man that is the kind of man that you'd want to marry, or raise a daughter, you know, raise those kind of people, have those kind of conversations. Raise good people who care about other people's feelings. Outside of bullying, the world could certainly use more people like that. And these are people that develop resilience. These are kids that develop motivation and goals. These are people that feel good about themselves, that have intact self-esteem and self-image. These are healthy people. So it's great.
Do you think kids are ever, though, one way at home and a different way, say, at school? So, like, you know, maybe they're picked on by an older sibling at home, and then, but they're perfectly fine, you know, in their behavior, but then they might go to school or
Yeah.
to, like, I can remember my kids playing soccer and getting kicked in the leg on purpose by
Yeah.
opposing team members, but, like, I think most parents do try the best they can, but, like, what does make a kid bully?
It's a great question. So some of what we talked about, learned behavior, sometimes not having a positive outlet for things that are going on, hurt people hurt. So a lot of times we've got kids with not intact self-esteem, kids with pretty low self-image, kids who have witnessed violence, been exposed to violence, kids who have been victims themselves sometimes. You know, if you've got an older sibling who's significantly abusing or bullying you, and then you're passing on to either a younger sibling or someone in your school, I mean, that's pretty significant. But I also think, you know, sometimes it's just that lack of understanding and connecting with people. The thing we have to remember is what we're finding is the more time that goes on, the less and less connected people are. We don't have kids playing in the cul-de-sacs anymore out in the middle of the street. We don't have multi-generational play groups for kids anymore. You know, typically kids are in kind of homogeneous mixtures of all the 6-year-olds or all the 8-year-olds. We don't have that natural free time, and we don't have that ability where multiple adults are disciplining kids like in neighborhoods or extended family settings anymore. And because of that, kids aren't always getting the kind of feedback, and they don't have the connectedness to other people. They spend a lot of time behind screens, whether it be on the social media or in video games or on chat, and it doesn't take the place of real connectedness from somebody. What we're talking about here is this idea of attunement. And attunement is the connectedness that you feel to somebody else that makes you connected to them in a way that you genuinely care about what happens to them and you're able to kind of feel with them a little bit. And you can't be attuned to somebody behind a screen. That only comes from that contact with each other.
Do you think like some of the things, say on television or like in what's going on politically now, and kids are seeing all the fighting and all the reality shows on
Absolutely.
television? Like I think kids who are like say in middle school and are watching reality shows, like do they know that this is not real life?
No,
Or-
they don't. That's because that becomes their real life. I think that's a really good point. Everything from reality shows to the politically charged climate, through, and people's conversations around it, to sometimes what I just call like snarky behavior of some of those shows geared towards preteens. It was really interesting. I talk a lot about some of the shows that we get portrayed on Nickelodeon and the Disney Channel, and how a lot of times the kids are just really, really snarky on these shows. They're really rude to adults. They're really sarcastic, and even though they're not necessarily bullying, the message is if you want to be cool, this is the kind of behavior that you put out, and how is that interpreted and acted in our kids' real lives? No, kids take what they're exposed to, and that becomes their reality. Let's think about a simple example of a 10-year-old who comes home after school and watches a television show about high school kids on the Disney Channel. If all you see is a bunch of kids go to school on a boat on some show on the Disney Channel, what are you going to think high school looks like? On a boat, right? That becomes your schema around that. That becomes your understanding around that.
And there are never any parents.
There's never any parents, and the adults are typically dumb
Yes.
and ineffectual on these shows. They're disconnected, they're goofy, and they're ineffectual in solving problems, which is another really important thing for us to think about with messages to kids. Kids learn that adults cannot help your problems, and if you need something taken care of, you have to deal with it yourself. And what we know is that's just not accurate. Kids have lots of loving, helpful adults, even beyond their primary caregivers. They have teachers, they have school support personnel, they have counselors, they have older siblings, they have extended family, they have grandmothers. They have lots of support systems in place to help them when they're on either side of the bullying conundrum.
Well, what do you think is the best approach to take if you feel your child is being bullied? Like I see parents on social media, like my kids are older now, but
Yeah.
I see on social media, parents talking about their kids dealing with it in school. Some people have even commented like, oh, they, maybe have a teacher who's a little, on the verge.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then other kids doing it. So, like I remember when my sister was bullied, this was back in the 60s, my mother called the other mothers, and it actually made it worse for my sister. But, I mean, what do you do? How do
It's a
you
great question.
help your child?
So the first thing that you should do is have a conversation with your kids. Because again, I go back to those, mean moments, teasing, and bullying. I'll give you a great example of why the first conversation is with the kids. I had a mother bring in a child who she was really concerned was being bullied. 15-year-old kid, probably at the beginning of the school year, so maybe about 4 or 5 weeks ago. And mom had sent me all these emails, and she called, she was really, really worried. And when they got to the office, the kid had no idea why she was here because the parent hadn't had any conversation with her about what was going on. And the story behind it was she had found a text on her daughter's phone from another girl at the school that she went to. She goes to a pretty elite school around here. And the text said, I hate you so much, I will never trust you again. You always do this to me. Called her a bunch of names, we're done. And mom was super concerned. So the kid was really caught off guard, and mom said, I said, so what was up with that? And she said, I'm gonna be really honest with you. She said, we both liked the same boy and he wanted to go out with me. And I said, so how do you feel about this text? She said, she was really mad, it didn't really bother me that much. So mom had got this worked up, but this was an example of a mean moment, right? Now there were some kids that maybe don't have as an intact sense of reality or of resiliency as this kid did that might be much more deeply affected by that. which is why that first conversation is about how much what's going on is affecting that child. The second thing is, depending on that level of how it's affecting the child, seeking out supports, starting to intervene. If it's going on in school, starting the conversations with the school. If it's going on somewhere else, trying to help the kid find some other outlets and some other friend groups. It doesn't just happen at school. I had a kid once that was bullied in a Girl Scout group, and this was her extracurricular activity. She didn't want to give up Girl Scouts, she couldn't really work it out with the other kids, so finding another Girl Scout troop for her where she could, still have her interests and be able to move on from that. And also giving the kid an outlet. If you have a kid that's going through bullying, please cue in a mental health professional. This is somebody who's going to be able to go in and look at the risk factors, be able to assess the protective factors and resiliency of a kid. The example of the kid I just gave you, she was a really resilient kid. She had a great sense of self. She had really great friendships and realities and relationships in her life. And she was frankly a little caught off guard that her mother had dragged her in here, right? So this was a kid, when I was assessing her, I knew we were at a pretty low risk here, given the single scenario that had gone on. Now I have kids that are a lot more fragile than that and don't have that intact sense of self, and something that would absolutely crush them. So it's again, knowing that kid and also knowing your kid and also cueing in that professional. So it's a great question.
I worked with a 16-year-old, 17-year-old girl recently who was bullied. It was unrelenting. And the family had gone to the school, and the school was not skillful in addressing it.
Yep.
That happens a lot, right?
Absolutely.
You hear that all the time. And it got to the point where the advice was, and I had supported them to say, time to move to a new school. At some point, you just have to do that.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember, again, I don't work for a specific school district, but we live in a world where people are also concerned about consequences for themselves. And a lot of times it's risky for an organization or a school system to say, yes, this is going on in our school. And because of that, unfortunately, I think it shuts down a lot of really appropriate interventions that our victims and our bullies really need within school systems. But it's really important to know when enough is enough. And again, this is something that, the case you're talking about, we're a trained professional involved, cueing in that trained professional to work with you and your family. Great. Other questions? Well, I appreciate you guys coming out tonight. I think this was great, and I hope that you take some information with you and are able to use it for the people in your life.
And we want to thank you, Liz. Liz, would you mind just giving the website?
Sure,
for Enlightened
absolutely.
Interventions?
If anybody would like to reach out or has further questions, my business is Enlightened Interventions. We are located in Worcester, and our website is www.enlighteninterventionsllc.org. And our best email is enlightenedinterventions@gmail.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz.
Thanks.